A massive breakthrough in Gaza, with the world looking on as the landmark Donald Trump brokered peace deal was signed. Among those looking on, those who fled here to escape the war.
Hello, I'm Khaled Al-Astal, a Palestinian Irish who lives now in Dublin with two kids, Ali and Sarah. In the war in Gaza, I lost my wife, my brother, and my mom, with so many other family members. For the last 2 years, we were hoping that my dad and my two Irish citizens brothers will be here with us. And now it's 2 years and they're still in Gaza.
If people think that Khaled's voice is a little familiar, it is because, Zara, he's been on the group chat with us before.
Yeah, he's been in studio with us actually before, and I've met Khaled many times over the last 2 years. So look, I suppose, as he said there, Gavin, they're looking at the situation in Gaza now. They still have family members that have been left behind who are struggling to try and make a life for themselves in Gaza, and they're thinking about what the future might hold. And they're thinking about family reunification, which is an understandable ambition for anybody in that situation. To remind our viewers and listeners of Khaled's story, his wife was killed in Gaza very early on into the conflict. His mother died. They have lost other extended family members. There was his cousin and a number of his close friends. So, for all that he has been through, they are, getting by in life, and their kids are doing well, thankfully. And he was telling me this morning that they're doing really well, that Ali is doing really well in school. Sarah is only a baby, his daughter. But for this family, they are considering what their next options will be. And I think, Richard, reunification is a big factor in all of that.
Hugely so, but the amount of uncertainty, which obviously still hangs over the situation, is not lost on anyone who is, considering reunification, considering whether or not to ever go back to Gaza, or whether or not they'll ever be able to go back to Gaza, considering what life is going to be there, what efforts they'll have to do to try and rebuild their homes, their street, the families that have been torn apart by the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. One other person we were talking to this week, Dua Ahmed, who is from Gaza. She was evacuated from there just a few short months ago.
Hello, it's Dua from Gaza. I was evacuated to Ireland 3 months ago to continue my study as a postgraduate student in Limerick. And I'm a teacher and a mother to two beautiful boys, Hassam and Ramadan. Hassam is 11 and Ramadan is 8. They are beautiful boys, and I hope one day that I can hug them in peace, and I will never give up on that.
Dua's, both her boys are still in Gaza. That is obviously something which has been a huge concern for her. Communication, as anybody who we've talked to over the last 2 years, who has family in Gaza or who has been in Gaza and then got out, or whatever the situation may be, communication is an absolute nightmare at the very best of times. So you can imagine the worry that Dua has been through over all of this period. It's something which has been replicated even by the Alaga family, Ibrahim, Hamida, all of their family who've been through this situation. It is something which is going to remain a problem as well, because the infrastructural problem in Gaza, even if the ceasefire does hold, is not going to be repaired.
I actually just can't imagine what it must be like, actually, the anguish of a mother being separated from her sons for a couple of years at a time, even in peacetime, where you had open communication. So the idea of not being able to keep real-time contact all the time, I just can't imagine how difficult that must be.
Yeah, it was a similar situation actually for Khaled, just to remind people, in relation to, I suppose, he had been working outside of Gaza at the time when all of this, on October 7th happened, and he was working to obviously send money home to his family. So it was a very similar situation in that he was separated from his children and was, under enormous pressure to try and reunify with them at that time.
One of the reasons why, of course, family reunification might not be as straightforward as we might have hoped is because we would have thought at this point that if the 20-point plan and the ceasefire agreement, such as it was, as agreed last year, had everything gone according to plan, the Rafah crossing would be a little bit more open, and that there would be the much more open transit of people who have been displaced, not just within Gaza, but also to Egypt and elsewhere, will be able to get back in. And that would be step one to people being able to go back home and being able to reunify their families. It's not proven to be quite so straightforward this week.
Very patchy at this point. Some of the main issues which have arisen, a lot of people, anybody who's been watching the news will have seen that there is some consternation amongst the Israeli government and families in Israel over the returning of the remains of hostages taken by Hamas. Hamas has said that it is very, very difficult under the current parameters of the ceasefire in terms of where the Israeli forces are at the yellow line, and because of all of the buildings which have been blown apart over the last 2 years. It is very hard to retrieve all of the bodies at this point in time. Now, also on the other side of that, Israel has threatened to limit the amount of aid which is going to be entering Gaza. There's questions over the Rafah crossing, as you say. They've threatened to half the amount of aid that has gone into Gaza. All of this is a very, very flimsy ceasefire deal. If this is the base level, the easiest thing you can agree, which has seen captives on both sides being returned to their families, and there's actually a point, an asterisk on that, I suppose we should come back to in a little bit later on. But if this is where we're at this point, it does cast doubt on where exactly we do end up when we try to move on to the stickier, long-term parts of the deal.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of steps to get through, Gavin, isn't there? I mean, it's not like there's no guarantee that with every step you pass, it's obviously progress and everyone is hoping for the best. But the reality is that the difficulty of getting through those.
Yeah, and the point that Richard makes around how it's very difficult to recover the remains of hostages who passed away at various points in the last 2 years, that it's very difficult to do that if they were laid to rest in places that are now under further rubble. It's next to impossible. And Hamas have been very open about that when they've been using the Red Cross and the Red Crescent as intermediaries. They say, we're going to need some specialist help to be able to try and clear these paths and to try and exhume remains that may have been laid to rest because they are now buried under rubble. And one thing that I've actually found very striking when you go back to the reunification and the scenes that we saw in the last week of the exodus of people going back to the north of Gaza, to areas they haven't been able to go to for a while, is even though we sort of feel like we knew what was coming, that these people were returning home, there is still the tangible moment where the penny drops in the eyes of people who just haven't been home for the guts of 2 years. And they realise that basically what they're going back to, the place, the soil, such as it is home, is literally just dust, that there's nothing else. It's almost like a lunar surface, and how little there is of what they thought was home. And of course, they can all cling to the hope that they could go back and that there would be some shelter and something that resembles what used to be their lives. But I've lost count of how many different bits of footage I've seen in the last week of people who hoped that they were going home and were actually just finding that home was just a pile of rubble from which it's impossible to make a life. And those people who now want to remain home but don't exactly know how they're going to even feed themselves or build any kind of life once they're there.
Well, I did actually ask Khaled this morning when I was speaking to him how he feels about the peace deal and the likelihood of it sticking and what the future of it might look like. And we can take a listen to what he had to say.
People in Gaza, including even myself and everyone who's outside Gaza, are having hope that this ceasefire will last. But everyone is now very worried and very careful, hoping for the best, because we know things are very complicated. And still until now, the Rafah crossing board didn't open. And it's not even safe now in Gaza. So we have hope, but we're still very careful with our hope.
One of the things I think I've noticed over the last week, really, since the ceasefire deal was announced, is huge amount of relief for people who are obviously in Gaza, because able to go to bed, generally speaking. There has been exceptions. There has been drone strikes and bombings and all that sort of stuff, without the fear that they may not see the next morning. And then there's people outside who understandably are casting doubt and are saying we can't trust A, Donald Trump, or B, the Israeli government to put all this into place. But I asked Dua about her view on this, and she echoed that the view in Gaza is, thank God my children are going to be safe for another day. But there are questions she has about whether or not people will stick to the agreement that was made.
I'm truly glad that there is a ceasefire finally in Gaza, and that my people can breathe even for a little while, because I can't hide my uncertainty and fear, that because I've witnessed many ceasefires being broken before. And I still remember one night during a ceasefire when the bombing started again while we were sleeping. It was terrifying. It was terrifying to know that you are safe, and then you feel, oh my God, it's not safe anymore, and it's a terrible feeling. And that's why I find it really hard to trust or believe that this ceasefire will last.
I suppose they're hoping for the best, but they know that the possibility is that things may become difficult again over time. You mentioned, Gavin, there the imagery of people going back to try and find their homes and trying to sort of establish what was left of the life they left behind. Yeah. And I'm also struck by, the reality, Richard, of some of the people who thought maybe loved ones they hadn't seen for a while might just still be back home, and then they're having this realisation that actually those loved ones are potentially gone. On the other side, the Israelis are coming to terms with being reunited with their loved ones who they lost on October 7th. And we did see a lot of those pictures this week of that reunification and the, reconnecting, I suppose. And when we talk about the hostages and families being reunited, in a lot of ways, these people are very different people to the ones they lost 2 years ago. Everyone on both sides has been through so much that there will be an inevitable time period where they will have to process what they've been through and try and rebuild those relationships.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when we spoke to Tom Hand within the last couple of years on the podcast, and he thought that he'd lost his daughter Emily, and then Emily was discovered to be alive, and then Emily was eventually recovered and be allowed to return home.
At that time, do you remember Tom Hand had said that it would have been better had she been gone than be inside Gaza, because such was his fear of what would have happened at that time.
But even at that point, when Emily had been in custody for a far shorter time than the last of the 20 living men had been with Hamas for the last 2 years, already there were such questions of, well, and how do you try to, undo some of the psychological trauma and everything else that you will have endured simply by being away from home and in the captivity of strangers for that long.
And similarly for the Palestinian people, because on both sides there's psychological trauma for all of them.
Yeah, and it's not a thing that you can just overcome or rebuild from. Like, this is going to be deep-seated and is likely to be intergenerational, much as a lot of other trauma that we know. We have some experience of it in this island, that even when you rebuild from things, it's not just a thing you can pretend never happened. It's always going to be carrying something with you. Richard, there was a point about the exchange of prisoners that you wanted to come back to, or about
the exchange of captives. Yeah, Gavin, something I think we've seen a lot of the coverage over the last week, particularly around the release of Israeli captives back to their families in Israel. One thing which I think hasn't got a huge amount of coverage in the West has been the conditions and actually the exchange of captives from Palestine. So about 2,000 people, including 250 people who've been serving life sentences in Israeli prisons, were returned to their families or were meant to be released. And then 1,700 people who are arbitrarily and without charge taken by the IDF in Gaza. Some of them included children, some of them included the infirm, some elderly people with Alzheimer's. All of them were just locked up, no charge whatsoever. Now, some of the people who were released, there was a list provided by Israel. These are all the people who are going to be released. And can you imagine the relief, the excitement, the jubilation of families saying, oh my God, I'm going to finally see my husband, my father, and then they're not returned. They're not returned because they're sent out of the country to be deported. If they're waiting for you, if this is a family from the West Bank, from Ramallah, and the IDF decides to release them in Gaza, they may never see them again. Yeah. You have been effectively split up as part of an exile process. Also as well, Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, he's somebody who the West saw a lot of over a period of months because he was the director of the Kamal Adwan Hospital. Remember, the whole hospital was destroyed effectively. Mm-hmm. He was taken into captivity without any charge. He's been there for months and months and months. Amnesty International says he has been tortured and starved in prison, lost a significant amount of weight and has developed scabies. He was meant to be released, but they've extended his period of detention. So he is this is a hospital director, another one of many medical workers who have been kept without charge by the IDF and by the Israeli government. And one final point as well, because this hasn't got covered actually a lot at all. The bodies, because there's been exchange of bodies, and that's where the sticking point comes from in terms of Hamas. But many of the Palestinian bodies returned to Gaza by the Israeli forces have shown signs of torture and execution, according to doctors at Nasser Hospital, including blindfolds, cuffed hands and bullet wounds to the head. So this is important stuff that does probably need to get covered.